I'd rather die, the captive said when the cowboy paid $3. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. In the rugged, sun-scorched lands of the Wild West, a man named James Holden had a reputation that stretched across the frontier. A man of few words and fewer ties. He spent his days roaming the plains, his only companions the dusty trails and his horse, Midnight. But even the most solitary of men find their lives upended by fate when they least expect it. One scorching afternoon, as the heat shimmered off the earth like a mirage, James found himself standing in front of a dilapidated cabin, worn by years of wind and neglect. Inside, a young woman lay chained, her once pristine clothes now stained with dirt and blood. Her name was Alice, and she had been held captive by a cruel band of outlaws who had been terrorizing the region for weeks. James had been tracking these outlaws for days, his patience and determination keeping him on their trail. But it was not just revenge that spurred him on. It was a sense of justice, the need to right the wrongs done to innocent people. Alice's condition told a story of brutal abuse, but it was her eyes that spoke volumes. Despite everything she had endured, there was still a flicker of defiance in those deep brown eyes. When James first approached her, her lips barely parted as she whispered, "I'd rather die than live like this." The words were chilling, but they fueled his resolve. James had dealt with cruelty before, but never had he seen such a desperate and defeated soul. With no hesitation, he unlocked her shackles, lifting her up gently as she winced from the pain of her wounds. But there was no time to dwell on her suffering. The outlaws would return, and he had no intention of being caught in their trap. As James helped Alice to her feet, she shot him. A look of disbelief. "You'll regret this," she muttered, her voice raw from lack of use. "They'll kill you." James met her gaze with calm determination. "Not if I kill them first," he said, his voice steady as the barrel of his rifle. Alice shook her head, not understanding the man who had just freed her. She had grown used to betrayal, to broken promises, to the cold indifference of men who took what they wanted. She couldn't fathom why James would risk his life for a stranger. But James wasn't just any man. He was someone who believed in the idea of justice, someone who had fought for it his entire life. And now, for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his actions, decisions that would change the course of both their lives forever. But there was something more at play here, something Alice didn't know yet. As they made their way towards safety, Alice began to question everything she had known about the world. Could there really be someone who cared? Someone willing to pay the price for justice? But as the sun began to set behind them, casting long shadows over the desert, one thing was certain. The journey ahead would not be easy, and it would require more than just courage to survive. It would require a strength neither of them had fully understood yet. James held Alice's fragile form steady as they made their way across the rough terrain, the weight of her wounds making each step a challenge. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the vast desert landscape. The air was thick with the smell of dust and the distant hum of cicadas, but it was a different sound that held James' attention, hoofbeats in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. The outlaws were not far behind. He could feel the pressure mounting. Alice, though barely able to stand, could sense the change in the air. Her pulse quickened as she glanced around nervously, her earlier defiance now replaced by a quiet dread. "We won't make it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "They'll find us before we can escape." James kept his pace steady, his hand gripping the reins of Midnight with a strength that betrayed his calm exterior. "We've got a chance," he muttered. "I'm not giving up." He knew better than anyone how quickly things could go wrong. He had seen men fall, seen plans unravel, but he couldn't afford to let that happen now, not when someone else's life depended on him. "You don't know these men," Alice continued, her voice trembling. "They'll hunt you down. They won't stop until they've killed you." James glanced at her, his face hard but resolute. "Then we'll make sure they don't get the chance." The night was quickly falling around them, and the air grew colder as they moved deeper into the canyon. The tall cliffs on either side of them loomed like silent sentinels, their jagged edges cutting against the darkening sky. They had to keep moving, keep finding shelter before the outlaws caught up. But Alice's condition was worsening, and James knew they wouldn't make it much further without rest. He scanned the landscape, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a narrow cave hidden behind a thicket of bushes. It was small, but could provide the cover they needed. He guided Midnight toward the entrance, helping Alice down from the horse. "We'll rest here for a bit," James said, his voice firm but soft as he settled Alice onto the ground. She winced, the pain in her side clearly taking its toll, but she didn't protest. James took a deep breath and looked out into the night. He was a man of few words, but tonight, the silence between them spoke volumes. He didn't know what had driven him to risk everything for Alice, a woman he barely knew. Perhaps it was the injustice of it all, or perhaps it was something deeper, something in the way she had looked at him with those eyes full of pain and resilience. But whatever it was, he knew he had already made a decision. He would fight for her. They would survive this. James leaned against the rock wall of the cave, his rifle resting in his lap. The sound of distant hooves still echoed through the canyon, growing louder with every passing minute. He knew they were close. The outlaws would be here soon. Alice sat beside him, her head resting against the cold stone, her eyes fluttering shut. For a moment, James allowed himself to relax, his grip loosening on the rifle. He closed his eyes briefly, his mind running through the plan he had in mind, how he would deal with the outlaws, how he would make sure Alice was safe. But just as quickly, the sound of approaching horses brought him back to reality. He stood, alert once more, his hand reaching for the rifle. The outlaws were closing in, and James knew that this was the moment of truth. There would be no turning back now. Alice stirred beside him, her hand reaching out weakly. "You're going to fight them, aren't you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. James nodded. "I'm not letting them hurt you. Not after everything they've done." The distant sound of hooves grew louder, and James took a deep breath, his hand tightening around the rifle. He glanced at Alice, his face softening just for a moment. "Stay here," he instructed. "I'll take care of this." Alice's eyes met his, a flicker of gratitude in them, but also a deep fear. "Be careful," she whispered. James gave her a reassuring nod before stepping out of the cave. The moonlight bathed the canyon in an eerie glow as he moved into position, ready for what was to come. The outlaws would be here soon, and they would regret underestimating him. It wasn't just about saving Alice anymore. It was about justice. It was about making sure that no one else would suffer at the hands of these men ever again. The night air was thick with tension as James crouched behind a boulder, his eyes fixed on the approaching outlaws. The distant sound of hooves had stopped momentarily, and he could feel the anticipation in his bones. The canyon was a natural echo chamber, and the slightest sound carried for miles. He had no idea how many men were coming, but he knew that each one of them would be armed and dangerous. There was no room for mistakes. He glanced back at the cave, his heart briefly softening as he saw Alice still hidden inside, her form barely visible against the shadows. She had insisted on staying behind, but James knew she was scared, and rightly so. She had been through enough already. Now it was his turn to make sure she didn't face any more terror. The outlaws had been tracking them for hours, and James knew they would not stop until they found Alice. But he also knew something else. These men had made a grave mistake by underestimating him. James had fought in enough skirmishes to know how to use the land to his advantage. He knew this canyon better than they did, and if it came to a fight, he would use every advantage he had. The horses were coming closer now, and James could hear their breath in the stillness of the night. He counted 4 riders, all on horseback, moving in a slow, calculated line. They were wary, too. He could tell by the way they moved. They knew they were being hunted, and they knew they had to be careful. James's grip tightened on his rifle as he waited, his pulse steady, his breath shallow. He had trained himself to remain calm in moments like these, but there was no denying the adrenaline that surged through his veins. He could feel the weight of the rifle in his hands, the familiar comfort of the cold steel against his palm. It was a reminder that, for all the fear, he was ready. The outlaws stopped just short of the cave, their horses pawing the ground nervously. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his face, dismounted. He looked around cautiously, his eyes scanning the darkness. The others followed suit, but they didn't move far. They knew someone was out here, waiting for them. James held his breath, praying they wouldn't hear him. The scarred man walked toward the cave, his boots crunching against the gravel. He stopped just in front of the entrance, his hand hovering near the handle of his gun. James could feel the tension in the air. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The scarred man bent down to peer inside, and that was when James made his move. In one smooth motion, he stood, rising from behind the boulder and firing his rifle. The shot rang out, sharp and clear in the cold night. It struck the man in the shoulder, sending him stumbling backward, his hand going instinctively to the wound. His horse reared, but the other riders didn't wait for orders. They scrambled for their weapons, drawing their guns as they fired into the darkness. But James was already moving, darting from one piece of cover to another, his rifle steady in his hands. The outlaws were disorganized, their panic obvious. They had expected an easy kill, but James was no ordinary target. He was a seasoned fighter, a man who knew how to stay alive. He fired again, hitting one of the outlaws in the leg, sending him sprawling to the ground with a scream. The other two riders hesitated for just a moment, giving James the time he needed to reload. He didn't hesitate. With a steady hand, he fired once more, taking down the second man in a clean shot to the chest. The last outlaw, the scarred man, had managed to regain his footing, but he was badly injured. He staggered toward James, his gun aimed, but his steps were sluggish. James raised his rifle, his eyes cold and focused. "This is the end of the line," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his intent. The outlaw hesitated for a moment, his hand shaking as he aimed at James. But it was too late. With one final shot, James ended the fight. The last man crumpled to the ground, his gun slipping from his hand. The canyon fell silent once more. James stood in the aftermath, his chest heaving with exertion, but his mind was already moving forward. He didn't have time to celebrate. He had to check on Alice. He turned quickly, making his way back to the cave, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached the entrance, he found Alice sitting against the wall, her eyes wide with fear. But there was something else in her gaze now, something that hadn't been there before. It was a flicker of hope. "You're safe," James said, his voice softer now, filled with relief. Alice looked up at him, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. But no words came out. Instead, she simply nodded. James extended his hand to her, helping her to her feet. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion settling in his bones. "But we will be." They still had a long way to go before they were truly safe. But for the first time in what seemed like forever, James felt like they had a chance. The moon hung high above the canyon, casting a pale glow over the desert floor as James and Alice continued their journey. The sounds of the night, once filled with the distant echoes of hooves and gunfire, had quieted, leaving a stillness that pressed against them. Like a weight, James had led them to a small outcrop, a hidden valley nestled between the towering cliffs, where they could rest and regroup. The air was crisp, and the stars twinkled like distant flames in the night sky, but the peaceful scene was a far cry from the chaos they had just escaped. Alice leaned against the rock wall, her body still fragile from the torture she had endured. Her wound had been treated, but she was far from healed, her strength slowly returning with each passing hour. She had been quiet for some time, but James knew better than to think she was asleep. She had been through too much to find rest easily. He sat across from her, his rifle resting against the ground, and for a moment, the silence between them was comfortable. He had seen the fear in her eyes, the distrust that had once defined her view of the world, but now, there was something else. It was a sense of gratitude, a quiet understanding that she had been saved, not by a stranger, but by someone who saw her as more than just a victim. Alice broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "Why?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the ground. "Why did you help me?" James didn't immediately answer. The question was simple, but the weight behind it was profound. He knew she had every right to ask. After everything she had been through, she had to wonder why a man like him, a man with his own demons, would risk so much for someone he barely knew. He shifted his gaze to the horizon, the orange hue of the setting sun still lingering in the sky. "I guess you could say I've seen enough cruelty in my life to last a lifetime," he said quietly. "And I've learned that it doesn't have to be that way. People like you, people like me, We don't deserve to suffer because of the actions of others. Someone has to do something about it. Alice looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for some deeper meaning, some hint of truth behind the words. You don't even know me, she whispered, shaking her head. Why risk everything for a stranger? James let out a long breath, his fingers tightening around his rifle. Because sometimes doing the right thing isn't about knowing someone, he said. It's about knowing what's wrong and making sure it doesn't go unchecked. He paused, his mind drifting back to the memories that had haunted him for years, the faces of those he had lost, the lives that had been taken, the innocent lives caught in the crossfire of greed and violence. I've seen too many people lose everything, and I couldn't stand by and watch you lose yours. Alice's expression softened, the hard edge in her eyes fading as she slowly nodded. She didn't have the words to respond, but the sincerity in James's voice told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't just a man of action. He was a man of conviction. And for the first time in a long while, she believed that someone could actually make a difference. But the danger wasn't over. James knew that. The outlaws wouldn't just give up. They had lost too much to let it go. He had to move quickly. He stood up, dusting off his clothes, and looked down at Alice. We'll need to keep moving, he said, his voice firm again. We can't stay here long. The outlaws won't stop until they find us. Alice nodded, her eyes steely with determination. She wasn't about to be anyone's victim anymore. She had already been broken once, but now she was ready to fight for her future. She slowly got to her feet, wincing from the pain, but there was no hesitation in her steps. Where do we go now? She asked. James glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. We head east. There's a small town near the river. It's our best chance to find some help. He picked up his rifle, checking it one last time, making sure it was ready for whatever came next. Stay close, he added, his voice low but steady. And don't trust anyone. Not yet. Alice followed him as they began to make their way out of the valley, the heavy weight of their situation settling back in. They had made it this far, but the road ahead would be even harder. The outlaws were still out there, and James knew that the coming days would bring even more danger. But he also knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let anyone take Alice from him. Not again. As they moved through the darkening desert, the distant howls of wolves echoed in the distance, a reminder that they weren't alone. But for the first time since their journey began, James felt a flicker of hope. He had a purpose now, something to fight for, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. As James and Alice continued their journey through the darkening desert, the silence between them became more comfortable, though neither of them spoke much. James kept his eyes on the path ahead, his senses alert to every sound in the distance. Alice, on the other hand, was beginning to feel the weight of her escape. The pain from her wounds had dulled, but her mind was still racing. She couldn't shake the images of the outlaws, their faces, the way they had hurt her. She had been running for so long, her life nothing more than a series of escapes, and yet she still found herself in danger. She looked over at James, wondering what kind of man he was. He had risked everything to save her, and she still couldn't fully understand why. He was a stranger to her, yet he had treated her like she was worth saving. It was something she had never experienced before, and it made her feel a mix of gratitude and confusion. You don't have to keep protecting me, Alice finally said, her voice low but firm. James glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in her words. I'm not protecting you because I have to, he replied, his voice steady. I'm doing it because I choose to. Alice looked at him, surprised by the intensity in his tone. Why? She asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. James hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting to the horizon before he answered. Because what happened to you isn't right, he said simply. No one should go through that. No one should be treated the way you were. I know what it feels like to be helpless, and I'm not about to let that happen to anyone else. Not if I can do something about it. Alice's heart softened at his words. She had been so used to living in fear, to the idea that everyone in her life had some agenda or selfish reason for their actions. She had never had anyone fight for her without asking for something in return. It was foreign to her. But there was something about James, something genuine, that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, there was hope for her yet. The night stretched on as they traveled, the moon high above them. They were still a long way from the town James had mentioned, but they were making good progress. They had to be careful, though. The outlaws were still out there, and they would be looking for them. James knew they couldn't afford to be caught off guard. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sound, a rustling in the bushes to their right. James immediately stopped, raising a hand to signal Alice to be quiet. He crouched low, his eyes scanning the darkness. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps, too quiet to be the wind. Someone was out there. James motioned for Alice to stay behind him as he moved silently toward the sound. He wasn't sure who it was, but he wasn't taking any chances. His hand tightened around his rifle as he slowly advanced, each step measured and deliberate. The moonlight barely illuminated the path ahead, and every shadow seemed to hide danger. Just as he was about to round a bend in the trail, the figure emerged from the shadows, a lone rider, his horse steady beneath him. The rider's face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but the rifle slung across his back, and the way he held himself told James everything he needed to know. This was no traveler. This was someone with a purpose. "Who goes there?" James called out, his voice low but commanding. The rider paused, then slowly raised his hand in a gesture of peace. "Just a man passing through," the rider said, his voice calm and even. "I mean no harm." James didn't lower his rifle. "Then you'll understand why I can't let you get any closer," he said. "We're not looking for trouble, but we're not going to hesitate if you bring it." The rider didn't move, but his eyes seemed to study James, sizing him up. "You're the one they're looking for, aren't you?" he asked, his voice holding a strange edge. James's grip on his rifle tightened. "What do you know about me?" he demanded. The rider didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked over his shoulder, as if checking for something, before turning his gaze back to James. "I know they're close. The outlaws," he said, his tone low. "And I know they're looking for you." James's heart skipped a beat. He had known the outlaws wouldn't give up, but hearing it from a stranger made it all the more real. "I'm not running," James replied, his voice cold. "Not anymore." The rider nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding passing across his face. "I don't blame you," he said, "but you'd better keep moving. The town you're headed for is a dead end. It's not safe for you or the girl." James frowned. "Why are you telling me this?" The rider paused, then swung his leg over the horse, dismounting. "Because you're not the only one who's been wronged," he said quietly, his voice filled with a hint of regret. "And sometimes, justice isn't as simple as it seems." James studied him for a moment, unsure of what to make of the stranger's words. But there was something in the rider's eyes, something that spoke of the same pain James had seen in his own reflection. "What do you want from me?" James asked. The rider didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward Alice, who was still standing quietly behind James, then back at James. "Help me make things right," he said, "and I'll help you." James stood still, his rifle still in his hands, as the rider spoke. The words hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. "Help me make things right," the rider said again, his voice heavy with meaning. "And I'll help you." James eyed him cautiously, his mind racing. The offer was simple enough, but something about the stranger's tone didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just a matter of needing help. It was a plea for something more, something deeper. "What's your angle?" James asked, his voice low. "You don't just ride up out of nowhere and offer to help a man you've never met without wanting something in return." The rider looked him squarely in the eye, his expression unreadable. "I'm not interested in your money," he said flatly. "I'm after the same thing you are, justice. I've got a score to settle, and I could use your help." James didn't move. His fingers tightened around the rifle as he weighed the situation. It wasn't just the outlaws they were up against anymore. There was something else lurking in the shadows, a deeper web of betrayal and vengeance. "I've been running from them for too long," the rider continued, his voice quieter now. "I've seen what they do to people. They killed my family, burned my home. Now I want them to pay." James glanced at Alice, still watching the exchange from behind him. She had been quiet, her eyes tired but alert. The weight of their situation seemed to have settled deeper into her bones, but there was a quiet strength in her now, something she hadn't had before. James knew she had been through more than anyone should have to endure, but she was still standing, still breathing. He had promised her that he would fight for her, and that promise was one he intended to keep. "So, you're telling me that we fight the same enemy?" James asked, his voice steady but skeptical. The rider nodded, his eyes narrowing. "They've been terrorizing this land for too long. It's time someone did something about it." James stood still for a moment, considering the rider's words. There was no doubt in his mind that the outlaws were dangerous. They had killed before, and they would kill again if given the chance. But this offer, this alliance, was something he hadn't expected. It was a risk, but it might be the only chance they had to end it all. "All right," James said, his voice firm. "We'll do it. But if this turns out to be a trick, I'll make sure you regret it." The rider didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. "Fair enough," he said. "I won't let you down." With the deal struck, James knew their next steps would be crucial. They couldn't afford to waste any time. They had to move quickly, take the fight to the outlaws before they could regroup and retaliate. "We don't have long," James said, turning back to Alice. "We've got to get moving." Alice nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. She didn't speak, but James could see the determination in her face. She was ready to fight. They were all ready. The rider led them down a narrow path that twisted through the canyon, moving at a steady pace. The moon was high now, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The air was cooler, and the scent of sagebrush lingered in the night. But despite the tranquility of the landscape, James felt the tension in the air. This was no ordinary journey. They were headed into the heart of danger, where the outlaws were sure to be waiting. The rider, whose name James still didn't know, kept his head down as they walked. He seemed lost in thought, his face shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat. James couldn't help but wonder about the man's past, about what had brought him to this point. But for now, there were more pressing matters to focus on. "How do we find them?" James asked, his voice low. "How do we know where they are?" The rider stopped, looking over his shoulder at James. "I've been tracking them for weeks. I know their hideouts, their routes. We just have to get close enough, and I'll take care of the rest." James nodded, his mind already running through the possibilities. This wasn't just about saving Alice anymore. It was about ending the reign of terror these men had inflicted on the land. They had to pay. "Let's move out," James said, his voice hardening with resolve. The group continued through the night, their steps quick and quiet, moving with purpose. The rider led them with the confidence of someone who knew the land like the back of his hand, guiding them through the desert with ease. James kept his rifle close, his eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of movement. They had no time to waste. The outlaws were coming, and they wouldn't stop until they had their prey. But James wasn't going to let that happen. Not this time. This time, they would be the ones hunting, and they would make sure the outlaws wouldn't get away. The ride was long, the night stretching on for hours, but James felt a growing sense of determination. They were getting closer. He could feel it, and when the time came, he would make sure justice was served. The sun had just begun to rise when James and Alice arrived at the edge of a small, abandoned mining town. The rider, whose name James still hadn't learned, had led them here, and the place looked as if it had been untouched for years. The wooden buildings were half-rotted, the windows dark and empty, and the silence that hung over the town was thick, almost oppressive. It wasn't much, but it was the perfect place to plan their next move. James scanned the area, his hand resting on the grip of his rifle. The town seemed deserted, but he knew better than to assume they were safe. The outlaws would be watching, and they wouldn't be far behind. "This is where they're hiding," the rider said quietly, looking around the dusty streets with a sense of familiarity. "I know where they keep their supplies, where they sleep. We have to hit them hard and fast. If we give them a chance to regroup, we're done for." James nodded. The plan was simple: catch the outlaws off guard and take out their leaders. Alice had been silent since they'd arrived, but James could see the fear in her eyes. She was starting to believe in the possibility of a future, but she knew the dangers weren't over. She looked at James now, her expression a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I mean, this is it. We can't go back after this." James turned to her, his face hard but his eyes softening just a little. "There's no going back, Alice," he said. "But we've come this far. I'm not going to stop now." He could see that she was scared, but there was something else there too. Something that hadn't been there when he first met her. A glimmer of strength, of determination. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a fighter. They gathered their gear, moving with the precision of men who had done this kind of work before. The rider seemed to know exactly where they needed to go, and James trusted him, though his instinct told him to be cautious. As they made their way toward the heart of the town, the tension between them all grew. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. The wind, the rustle of leaves, the creak of an old sign swinging in the breeze. It all felt too quiet, too calm, as if the calm before the storm. They approached a dilapidated building at the center of the town, its walls marked with the signs of a long-abandoned place. The rider held up his hand, signaling for them to stop. He motioned for James to follow him inside. They moved through the door, into a dark, musty room filled with crates and barrels. The smell of stale wood and dust filled the air. The rider crouched beside a stack of crates, peering out through a small crack in the wall. "They're in there," he whispered. "The outlaws. Just beyond that building, in the back. We make a move now, and we take them by surprise." James nodded, signaling to Alice to stay low and keep quiet. They would have to move quickly. No hesitation, no second chances. The rider's eyes locked onto James. "We do this together," he said. "We make sure they don't get away. Understand?" James gave a sharp nod, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Understood." They moved into position, crouching low against the shadows. The plan was simple, but the execution would be anything but. As they prepared to make their move, James couldn't help but think about what this moment meant. They had come so far, faced so much, and now it all came down to this, taking the fight to the men who had destroyed so many lives. The outlaws were dangerous, and they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. But James knew one thing for sure. They were no match for him and the rider. The time had come. James felt a surge of adrenaline flood his veins as he prepared to take the first shot. But just as he was about to step forward, a sound stopped him in his tracks. Hoofbeats, coming from behind. James turned, his heart skipping a beat. It was a small group of riders, their horses kicking up dust as they approached. The outlaws had come for them. They had found them first. James's mind raced as he looked back at Alice. She was crouched low, her eyes wide with fear, but she wasn't backing down. The fight was coming, whether they were ready or not. And James wasn't going to let them take Alice or anyone else again. "Get ready," he whispered, his voice low. "This is it." The riders drew closer, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. There was no turning back now. James raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger, ready to fight for everything they had risked. The battle for justice was about to begin. The riders approached with relentless speed, their horses kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the air like a thick fog. James's heart raced as he steadied his rifle, watching the enemy draw closer. The outlaws were not giving them a chance to retreat. They had found them, and now there was no turning back. The rider beside James shifted into position, his face set in a hard expression. "We make our stand here," he said, his voice low but urgent. "They won't expect us to fight back this soon. We catch them off guard." James nodded, tightening his grip on the rifle. He could feel the tension in the air, thick with the weight of what was about to happen. Alice crouched low beside them, her face tense but determined. James glanced at her, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. In her gaze, he saw something different, a strength that hadn't been there when he first found her. She had transformed from the frightened woman he had saved into a survivor. She was no longer just a victim. She was part of this fight now. The first outlaw broke from the group, spurring his horse toward the narrow path that led into the heart of the town. James's finger hovered over the trigger as he lined up the shot. Just as he was about to fire, the rider beside him moved with surprising speed, raising his own rifle and firing first. The shot rang out, echoing through the canyon, and the outlaw on horseback fell from his saddle, his body crumpling into the dust. The other riders hesitated for a split second, clearly caught off guard by the quick retaliation. That hesitation was all James needed. He fired. The bullet found its mark, hitting one of the remaining riders in the shoulder. The man screamed in pain, his horse rearing up as he struggled to stay in control. He managed to stay on his mount for a moment longer, but then he collapsed, his rifle falling from his hand as he tumbled to the ground. "Keep moving," James shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. They couldn't afford to waste time. The outlaws had to be eliminated before they could regroup. The remaining two riders, now desperate, charged forward, their guns raised and ready. James dropped to one knee, firing once again. His aim was true, and another outlaw fell from his horse, his body crashing into the dirt. The last rider, now the sole survivor, wheeled his horse around, trying to make a quick escape. But James was faster. He aimed and fired, the shot ringing out like a Thunderclap in the still air. The rider lurched forward, his horse stumbling. Before he too was thrown to the ground, his weapon useless. The fight was over. The canyon fell silent, save for the distant sound of the wind. James stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. The rider beside him exhaled sharply, lowering his rifle. Alice, still crouched behind cover, slowly stood up, her eyes wide with disbelief at the swift and brutal fight they had just witnessed. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice a mix of awe and lingering fear. James looked around at the fallen riders, each one sprawled in the dust, their lives snuffed out in moments. "For now," he said grimly, "but they'll send more. We have to be ready." The rider, who had joined their cause, walked over to the fallen outlaws, his boots crunching on the dirt with each step. He paused at one of the bodies, kneeling to search it. "These men were working for someone," he muttered, pulling a small, folded piece of paper from the dead man's pocket. He unfolded it, his brow furrowing as he read the message. "This isn't over, not by a long shot. They've got a bigger operation going." James walked over, taking the paper from the rider's hand. His eyes scanned the words quickly, and he felt a chill run down his spine. The note mentioned a location, a nearby settlement that James knew well. It was a place where outlaws often sought refuge, a place full of corruption and danger. "We need to get there before they do," James said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We can't wait around for them to regroup." The rider nodded, his face grim. "You're right. This is bigger than we thought. We'll need to move quickly, stay one step ahead of them." Alice, still processing everything, looked between the two men. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We fight," James replied simply. "We finish what we started." The rider turned and began leading them back down the narrow path. "We have to make sure they never hurt anyone again. And I'll make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." James followed, his mind already racing through their options, but one thing was certain. This fight wasn't over. And no matter what it took, he would see it through to the end. The outlaws might have been defeated for now, but their leader, whoever he was, would not let this go unanswered. The war was far from over, and James knew they had a long road ahead of them. But for the first time in a long while, he felt the fire of determination burn bright inside him. They would finish this, no matter what. The dawn was just beginning to break, casting an orange glow over the landscape as James, Alice, and the rider approached the old mining settlement. It was a place James had known well in his younger years, a place where old battles had been fought and lost. The air felt heavier here, as if the very ground held the memories of the pain and suffering that had unfolded long before they arrived. The sun's light bathed the town in an eerie calm, but the stillness was deceptive. Danger lingered in the shadows, and James knew they were not alone. He glanced over at Alice, who had been quiet for the past few miles, her eyes focused on the road ahead. There was a new resolve in her demeanor now, something she hadn't shown before. She was no longer the frightened woman he had found chained in the outlaw's hideout. She had transformed into something stronger, more determined. James felt a flicker of pride. They had both come a long way, but the battle was far from over. The rider who had joined them, whose name James still didn't fully trust, was walking just ahead, his head swiveling to scan the area. He had led them here, but something about him felt off. James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story than he was letting on. Still, they had a common enemy now, and that was enough to keep them aligned, for the time being. "We need to make this quick," James said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "The longer we stay here, the more time they have to regroup. We can't let them get their hands on the supplies or the weapons in this town." Alice nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I'm ready," she said, her voice clear. "Let's finish this." The three of them moved forward cautiously, staying low and moving from building to building, using the wreckage of the old mining equipment as cover. They had learned from the last fight that staying hidden was their best chance. The rider led them to a decrepit building at the heart of the town, the one that had once served as a barracks for the workers. The doors were rusted shut, but a small window at the side provided just enough space for them to peek inside. James and the rider carefully approached the window, peering through the crack. Inside, the outlaws were gathered around a table, seemingly unaware of their presence. The leader, a tall man with dark, weathered skin and a scar running down his cheek, stood at the head of the group, his hand resting on a large map spread across the table. James's eyes narrowed. This was it. The man who had been pulling the strings, the one who had caused all the pain and suffering. He could see the other outlaws scattered around the room, sharpening knives and preparing weapons. They were ready for a fight, but they hadn't expected one to come to them so soon. James turned to the rider. "It's time," he said, his voice low. "We make our move now." The rider nodded, pulling a small pack of dynamite from his belt. "I'll take care of the back. You two move in from the front." James looked at Alice, who gave him a small but resolute nod. She was ready. Together, they moved into position, James at the front and Alice close behind. The rider disappeared into the shadows, heading toward the back of the building. The tension in the air was thick as James crept closer to the door. He could feel the heat of the sun on his back, the sweat trickling down his neck. It was now or never. With a swift motion, James kicked open the door, his rifle raised. The outlaws inside froze for a moment, caught off guard by the sudden intrusion. But it only took a second for them to draw their guns and aim them at James and Alice. "You're too late," the leader sneered, stepping forward with a pistol in hand. "You think you can stop me? I've killed men like you before." James didn't hesitate. He fired, hitting the leader square in the chest. The man crumpled to the ground, his gun falling from his hand. The room erupted in chaos as the other outlaws fired back, but they were disorganized, panicked. James and Alice ducked behind a table, returning fire as the outlaws scrambled for cover. The fight was fast and brutal, the sound of gunshots echoing through the building. The rider's dynamite went off with a deafening roar, and the back of the building exploded into a ball of fire and debris. The remaining outlaws screamed in terror, some of them running for the door, while others were thrown to the ground by the blast. In the midst of the chaos, James and Alice pressed forward, determined to finish this once and for all. Within moments, the fight was over. The outlaws were either dead or captured, their plans thwarted. The town was finally free from the terror they had brought. James stood amidst the wreckage, his rifle lowered but his chest heaving with exertion. Alice stood beside him, her eyes wide but resolute. They had won. For the first time in a long while, James felt a sense of peace settle over him. They had finished what they started. They had brought justice, not just for Alice, but for everyone the outlaws had hurt. "It's over," Alice whispered, her voice barely audible. James nodded, his heart light for the first time in what seemed like forever. It was over, and they had made it through, together. Get ready for an intense journey through the Wild West in this gripping tale of survival, justice, and revenge. Our story follows a lone cowboy, Alice, and an unexpected ally as they confront dangerous outlaws in a desolate mining town. As the story unfolds, the characters are forced to face their pasts and fight for their survival in a world ruled by lawlessness. This is one of the best Western stories that brings together heart-pounding action, deep emotional struggles, and unforgettable moments. With every step, the tension grows, and the stakes rise higher as they take on the forces of evil that have plagued the land. If you enjoy thrilling Western stories filled with unforgettable characters and dramatic twists, this one is a must-see. From explosive gunfights to moments of heartfelt connection, these Western stories will captivate you from start to finish. So buckle up for a ride through the dusty trails, where justice is hard-earned and victory is never guaranteed. Discover the power of determination and the bonds that form in the heat of battle as our characters take on the outlaws and fight for freedom in this unforgettable Western adventure. Don't miss out on these incredible Western stories that showcase bravery, resilience, and the true spirit of the American frontier.